My name is Mark. I'm 24, and I make a living doing what most people would call a one-way ticket. I'm a wildlife photographer. My job is to travel to places where cell service dies first, and the only neighbors you have are grizzly bears and pine trees. This time, I chose the northern forests of Washington State. The plan was simple. 3 weeks in an old ranger's cabin filming the deer migration and total solitude. The cabin was sturdy, made of cedar blackened by years of rain with tiny windows and a heavy oak door. Inside there was just a bed, a wood stove, and my desk with a laptop. The first 4 days were perfect. I set up 10 trail cameras in a 2-mile radius. These are motion-activated cameras. During the day, I'd roam the forest, and in the evenings, I'd return to light the stove, drink coffee, and transfer the footage to my drive. The silence was absolute. You know, the kind of silence that starts ringing in your ears after a few days. On the 5th day, the weather turned. The sky was choked with clouds so low it looked like the treetops were piercing right through them. I decided to check the cameras before the storm hit. 9 of the cameras showed nothing unusual. Birds, squirrels, a couple of foxes, but when I reached the 10th camera, the one hanging on the edge of a deep ravine, I felt something was wrong. The camera was tilted at a strange angle. Something had twisted its mount so hard that the steel strap had bitten deep into the tree bark. I took the camera down. It was covered in a strange, sticky slime that smelled like rotten fish and raw earth. A bear, I thought at the time, but something deep inside me twisted. Bears break things. They don't leave slime like this. Back at the cabin, I locked the door. Rain began to tap against the roof. I plugged the SD card into my laptop. The first 100 shots were empty, just swaying branches, then some shots of deer, and then the last 3 frames. In the first frame, there was a tree opposite the camera. Standing against the trunk was a creature. It was very tall, about 7 feet, and incredibly thin. But not like an anorexic person, more like something that had no skeleton at all. Its arms were unnaturally long. They touched the ground. I looked at the joints. There weren't any. The arm bent in a smooth arc, like a rubber hose or a snake. I couldn't see its face because of the shadows, just smooth, gray skin glistening in the rain. In the second frame, the creature was just a meter away from the camera. It tilted its head to the side at a 90-degree angle. Now I could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. There was no nose, no eyes, only one massive mouth that stretched from one side of its head to the other. Its thin, gray lips were pressed tight. But the third frame made my heart stop. It was a photo of my cabin. The shot was taken through the window. In the photo was me. I was sleeping in my bed, covered by my gray blanket, and right above my head at the headboard hung that boneless arm. It reached out from the darkness of the corner, and its long, tentacle-like fingers were frozen just inches away from my open throat. I jumped out of my chair so fast it flipped over. I looked at that exact corner of my bedroom, empty. Only the shadows from the stove danced on the walls. But on the pillow right where my head had been, I saw a wet spot. I stepped closer. It was that same slime, sticky, foul-smelling and still fresh. At that moment, a sound came from outside the cabin door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something soft and heavy sliding slowly across the wood, like someone had dragged a giant wet tongue over the door. "Mark." A quiet whisper came from outside. I froze. The voice was an exact match of my own, same tone, same pitch. Mark opened the door. My hands are cold. They're so long, I have nowhere to hide them. I grabbed the axe by the stove and yelled, "Get out! I have a gun!" I didn't have a gun, but it was the only lie I could think of. It went quiet outside. The rain intensified, turning into a downpour. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching the axe, when I heard a rustle from above. Something was crawling on the roof, but it wasn't footsteps. It was slaps, heavy, rhythmic slaps of something wet against the old tiles. It was right above me, and then I noticed that from the small vent in the ceiling, a thick, black liquid began to drip. It landed on my desk, right on my laptop's keyboard, and the plastic began to smoke, releasing a pungent smell of burning chemicals. This thing wasn't just strange, it was toxic. The hissing of the plastic filled the room. I realized the cabin I thought was my fortress was actually just a tin can this creature was slowly peeling open. I backed away as the laptop finally died, letting out a plume of foul smoke. The screen flickered with one last frame, that eyeless face, and went dark. My only light now was the dim headlamp on my head and the dying embers in the stove. The sound on the roof stopped right over the vent. I looked up and saw something gray poking through the narrow metal grate. At first I thought it was a snake, but it was a finger. Incredibly long, boneless, it wriggled in the air like a blind worm trying to feel for me. Then a second one appeared, then a third. The creature was literally screwing its boneless hand through the narrow gap where a child's hand wouldn't even fit. A sickening sound followed, the crunch of cartilage being crushed to pass through the metal. I knew that in a minute it would rip the vent out. I rushed to the window to pull the curtain, but I froze. At the glass, right at my eye level, was a face. It had no eyes, but the skin where the sockets should be was pulled so tight that the hollows of the skull showed through. Its giant mouth slowly stretched into a smile, revealing thousands of tiny, needle-sharp teeth. The creature didn't break the glass. It did something worse. It pressed its palm against the pane, and I watched as the glass began to melt under the black slime. It didn't crack. It became soft, like wax. "Mark." My voice came again, but this time it was coming from under the door. "Mark, I found your old album. Remember when you cried when you were 5? I remember too. Tears have such a salty taste." I felt a cold draft at my feet. I looked at the door. Through the gap at the threshold, thin, gray strands were sliding in. These were the fingers from its other hand. They looked like living threads reaching for my ankles. I screamed and swung the axe at the threads. The blade bit into the wood, severing one of the growths. Instead of a cry of pain, my own laughter came from behind the door. Loud, hysterical, exactly the way I laughed at a good joke. Black sludge sprayed from the stump. It hit my boot, and I immediately felt an agonizing pain. The skin on my foot was on fire. I ripped off my boot and sock, hissing in pain. Huge red blisters were already forming on my foot. I realized it doesn't just want to kill me. It's playing. It's tasting me piece by piece. The vent in the ceiling crashed down. Rain poured in through the hole. And an entire arm, about 3 meters long, fell into the center of the room. It writhed on the floor like a discarded garden hose. It was soft, but it had incredible strength. The arm wrapped around the leg of the heavy oak desk, and with one effortless jerk, threw it against the wall. My laptop, hard drives, everything was smashed to pieces. I was backed into a corner by the stove. The only things I had were an axe and a bucket of coal. Suddenly, the voice outside the door changed. It was now my mother's voice. She died 5 years ago. "Mark, honey, why is it so dark in here? Open up for Mama. It's so hard to breathe in this dirt." It was a low blow. I felt anger override my fear. "You're not her," I roared. I grabbed the poker, glowing red hot from the coals, and pressed it hard against the gray arm still writhing on the floor. A terrifying sound followed. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of boiling water and an ultrasonic whistle that made my ears bleed. The arm jerked, kicking up sparks, and shot back through the hole in the ceiling like a bullet. Silence fell. The downpour outside turned into a wall of water. I stood there panting, realizing I had wounded it, but this only angered the creature. But that only made the beast angry. Now it knew I could bite back. I looked at the window. The glass where the creature had pressed its palm was completely gone. Cold night air was rushing into the cabin. There was just a hole with smoking edges. And then I heard something new. From the ravine where I had found the 10th camera, a sound began to rise. It wasn't just one voice. It was hundreds of voices, all of them calling my name. The voices of my friends, teachers, ex-girlfriends, neighbors. A whole choir of my past was calling me into the darkness of the woods. Mark, Mark, come out and play. Mark. I looked through the hole in the window. In the darkness of the forest among the wet pines, lights began to flicker, but they weren't flashlights. They were white, lifeless faces. Dozens of these creatures were slowly crawling out of the ravine. They were weaving their long arms together, forming a living web between the trees. I wasn't just under siege. I was trapped by an entire nest, and the thing that had broken into my cabin was just a scout. The black sludge was still eating through the floor, and the choir of voices outside was getting louder. I knew if I stayed in this cabin for another 10 minutes, it would be my grave. I had to run for the truck even though I knew those things had likely cut my brake lines or were waiting for me in the shadows of the seats. I grabbed the gasoline canister for the generator by the stove. The plan was insane, but it was all I had. I doused everything. The bed, the remains of the desk, the walls, the smell of fuel filled my lungs, masking the stench of rotten fish. "You want to play?" I rasped, wiping blood from my ears. "Let's play bonfire." I threw the glowing poker onto the bed. The flames erupted instantly. Fire is the one thing all living creatures fear, even if they have no bones. The cabin turned into a fiery hell in seconds. I smashed the rest of the melted window with the butt of my axe and jumped out into the cold mud. Behind me, the cabin roared with flames. In that light, I saw them. They were everywhere. Dozens of gray figures hung from the trees, entwined by their boneless limbs like giant spiders. Those closest to the fire let out that ultrasonic whistle and backed away, covering their eyeless faces with their long palms. I bolted for my pickup parked 50 meters away. Mud splashed under my feet. Rain blinded my eyes. Suddenly a hand whipped out from the shadow of a tall cedar. It was thin as a lash and wrapped around my waist. The jerk was so violent it knocked the wind out of me. I was being pulled up toward the branches. I saw the creature. It sat on a limb, its head tilted, its mouth was open, and strings of thick saliva hung from it. It didn't mean to eat me. It was pulling me toward its face, as if it wanted me to look into that empty gray abyss where eyes should be. "Mark," it whispered, and this time the voice wasn't mine. It was the voice of the realtor who had rented me the cabin. "The contract isn't finished yet. You didn't return the keys." I screamed and swung the axe with all my might at the stretched arm whip. The blade sank deep into the soft tissue. Black blood sprayed across my face, burning my skin like acid. The creature shrieked, and its grip loosened. I fell into the mud from 3 meters up, hitting my shoulder hard. I didn't feel the pain, only the adrenaline making my whole body shake. I scrambled up and reached the truck. The keys. God damn it, the keys. They were left on the table in the burning cabin. I looked back. The house was entirely engulfed in flames, and in that light I saw something impossible. Creatures began to walk out of the fire. The flames burned their skin. It bubbled and peeled off in black tatters, but they didn't stop. They walked through the fire, reaching their arms toward me. They were burning, turning into living torches, but they kept coming. I jumped into the cab of the pickup and locked the doors. Long gray fingers immediately smothered the windshield. They began to press. The glass started to spiderweb with cracks. I remembered I had a spare key in the glove box. I ripped the lid open, dumping out receipts, Maps, some pills. There it was. The small key with the Ford logo. I shoved it into the ignition. The engine coughed and died. "Come on, baby, come on." I screamed, watching as an eyeless face pressed against the side window. The motor roared to life. I flipped on the high beams. The powerful rays cut through the darkness, and the creatures in front recoiled, shielding themselves with their arms. It turns out bright light hurt them as much as fire. I threw it in reverse and slammed the gas. The truck bounced over a mound, crushing one of those things under the wheels. There was a crunch, like crushing 1,000 empty plastic bottles. I made it to the forest road and drove like the devil was chasing me. In the rearview mirror, I saw the burning cabin slowly fade away, while gray shadows continued to flicker among the trees along the road. They were running after me, easily leaping over fallen trunks. I drove for an hour without slowing down until I reached the highway. There were streetlights here, asphalt and other cars. I pulled into a Shell gas station. I got out of the truck, staggering. My clothes were covered in mud and blood, my face burned by the black slime. A gas station attendant, an old man in a cap, walked up to me. "Son, you okay? You look like you met the devil in those woods." I couldn't answer. I just looked at my truck. Deep gouges, marks from claws and burns from slime, covered the hood, doors and roof. "I need help," I whispered. "Call the police. Back there in the woods." The old man nodded and led me inside the station. He poured me coffee and sat me down at a table. "Everything's gonna be fine now, son. It's quiet here. No one's gonna touch you." I started to calm down. The warmth of the cafe and the smell of cheap coffee acted like anesthesia. I looked at the wall of the gas station. There were bulletin boards: tractor for sale, lost dog, missing person. I looked closer at the last one. There was a photo of a guy. Mark. It was me. Date missing. April 12th, 2021. 5 years ago. My heart skipped a beat. "Hey," I called to the attendant. "Why is my photo here? I went missing 5 years ago. What are you talking about?" The old man slowly turned to me. He was smiling, but it was not the old man's kind smile. But it wasn't the kind smile of an old man. His lips began to stretch wider and wider, reaching his ears. "We told you, Mark." He spoke in my voice. "We don't eat flesh. We eat time. You were in those woods for 5 years, and all that time we were finishing off your memories." He reached his hand toward me over the counter. The arm began to lengthen. The elbow vanished, turning into a flexible hose. The fingers grew long and gray. I looked around in horror. Everyone in the cafe, the couple at the table, the truck driver by the window, they were all slowly turning toward me. And none of them had eyes, only massive mouths and boneless arms that they began to pull out of their sleeves. They hadn't chased me. They were already here. The whole world around me began to melt, like the glass in the cabin. The walls of the gas station became pink and pulsing. I realized I had never left the forest. I was still lying on that bed, and my brain was just creating one last illusion of escape while the creature digested my final thoughts. "Enjoy your meal, Mark." The voices in my head spoke in unison. The last thing I saw was the ceiling of the gas station turning into a giant jaw, slowly descending upon me. And outside on the dark highway stood myself, the Mark who had just arrived in the forest, waving cheerfully at me as he walked into his brand new cabin.